Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's dive right into the visual theater of international diplomacy. Today, we're decoding a truly pivotal meeting between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Donald Trump, which took place right on the sidelines of the G7 summit in France. We're going to unpack this complex geopolitical dynamic, and our goal today is to essentially create a beautiful video in your mind's eye of what's really going on behind the scenes. Because, international relations aren't just about dry treaties and trade deals. They're about personal chemistry, subtle cues, and strategic positioning. And honestly, there is no better way to understand this than by looking closely at how these two global leaders interact on the world stage. Now, you've got to notice the stark contrast in body language here. It's wild. It literally tells the story of an evolving global relationship. If you look back to their first meeting at the White House in 2017, it was defined by these famous, very public bear hugs. It was this warm embrace that signaled a massive new era of closeness. But look at the present reality. When they met at this recent G7 summit, the dynamic shifted entirely to a firm handshake and just a simple tap from Donald Trump. Prime Minister Modi, who's usually known to be quite expressive with his global counterparts, chose his very specific, dignified restraint. And guys, this wasn't an accident. This subtle but undeniable shift in physical interaction perfectly mirrors the diplomatic reality between the two nations right now, a reality that's seen a whole lot of recent friction. Part 1. The G7 Icebreaker. So picture this, set against the gorgeous, serene backdrop of this high-stakes French summit. The optics are absolutely crucial. This is a gathering of the world's most powerful economies, brought together to tackle massive global challenges. In a room filled with geopolitical tension, we see a fascinating dynamic playing out right in the front row. When the traditional G7 family picture was taken, the US president found himself in a room where a lot of traditional allies now actually stand as critics. It wasn't exactly a room full of friends for him. Yet, on one side of French President Emmanuel Macron stood Prime Minister Modi, and on the other, President Trump. Despite India not being a formal member of the G7 core group, the Prime Minister is placed prominently in the front row. That is a massive visual statement. In an environment lacking warmth for the US president, reaching out to the Indian Prime Minister, someone he historically shares positive vibes with, became a highly visible strategy. And that brings us to a brilliant turning point, the number 50. What does that mean? Well, it was a vital 50 minutes spent completely behind closed doors to break the ice between the two leaders. Before the cameras were even escorted out of the room, reporters noted an immediate, intense conversation sparking between them. At a time when commentators were openly wondering if Modi and Trump were actively avoiding each other, this 50-minute private session served as the ultimate icebreaker. It was absolutely crucial as a primer for their forthcoming bilateral meetings, giving them the private space they needed to start ironing out the significant wrinkles that had formed in their partnership. Moving on to Part 2, Stadium Rallies and Camaraderie. Now, to really grasp why an icebreaker was even needed in the first place, we've got to rewind a bit and look at the foundation of this relationship. Just look at this timeline. Over a decade, encompassing 8 different meetings across 2 Trump presidencies, this diplomatic equation remained remarkably consistent. It completely transformed from standard formal White House summits into massive, unprecedented spectacles. Back in 2019, we saw Howdy Modi in Houston, Texas, where over 50,000 people watched the two leaders share a stage. I mean, 50,000 people. It literally turned diplomacy into a stadium event. And then, months later, that was reciprocated with Namaste Trump in Ahmedabad, drawing another massive crowd. For a while, the partnership was seemingly defined by these grand, stadium-sized optics and a loud, highly visible friendship. But hey, it wasn't all just cheering crowds and flashy photo ops, Beyond all that grand spectacle, this camaraderie actually delivered real, tangible defense and strategic outcomes for the Indo-Pacific. The relationship expanded significantly into defense ties. We're talking moving forward with Predator drones, Apache helicopters, and even deep discussions around F-35 fighter jets. They deepened their counter-terror cooperation, putting significant scrutiny on Pakistan. And they forged totally new frontiers of engagement in critical modern sectors. Think 5G, artificial intelligence, and nuclear energy. These were massive, consequential steps forward for both nations. Part 3, 16 months of turbulence. Because let's be real, diplomacy is rarely a straight line, right? Despite the bipartisan support this relationship has enjoyed for 2.5 decades, the recent past has seriously tested the limits of the strategic partnership. The crucial thing to focus on here is this number, 16. 16 seriously turbulent months that necessitated this whole G7 icebreaker to begin with. The warmth shown by the Indian side during those massive rallies just wasn't entirely reciprocated in policy. Instead, a whole series of geopolitical and economic headwinds battered the relationship, bringing us right to that frosty dynamic we initially saw in France. So, what exactly caused this friction? Well, first off, the US slapped these 25% punitive tariffs on India, followed by even further tariffs, actions they notably didn't take against other large energy buyers. Then came these really strict restrictions on H-1B visas, which directly impacted Indian professionals. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just economics. There was also severe diplomatic strain, like the tragic death of Indian sailors, where the US issued a statement that India viewed as unapologetic. That heavily contrasted with the spirit of an allied partnership. On top of the whole shebang, there was significant geopolitical friction, with the US attempting to involve itself in situations regarding Pakistan and Kashmir in ways that really conflicted with India's sensitivities. Essentially, what we're looking at is a massive clash. On one side, you have rigid, unilateral trade actions, and on the other, the reality of a highly interconnected world. When one partner relies on unilateral strikes, it massively disrupts the intertwined supply chains that both economies heavily rely on. An isolated approach simply doesn't work when you're dealing with a deeply interdependent global ecosystem. As a result, India pushed back hard to protect its economic interests and its sovereignty, which leads us directly to the restrained body language we discussed earlier. Part 4. India at the high table. Yet, despite all this turbulence over those 16 months, India showed up at the G7 holding a remarkable amount of strategic leverage. They absolutely weren't coming hat in hand. They were taking their seat at the high table by sheer merit of their current global positioning. As observers on the ground noted, any attempts to trap or corner India diplomatically simply won't work anymore. In fact, journalists recalled a previous G7 summit in Canada, where there was an attempt to maneuver India into a specific White House handshake photo op just for narrative purposes. And India firmly sidestepped it. The message is incredibly clear. India will push back against narratives that don't serve their strategic interests, signaling for sure that they are no pushover. And honestly, India's spot in that front row makes total sense when you look at the metrics. They are increasingly seen as a vital solution to global supply chain crises. Just look at these facts. They're now a top 5 global economy and the fastest growing among the large economies. They're the world's largest democracy, and they hold the sheer demographic weight of being the most populous country on the planet. Post-2020, as the world faced massive supply chain disruptions, global leaders began looking directly at India for solutions. India isn't just a polite guest at the G7, they represent the existing reality of the modern world. You literally cannot forge meaningful global cooperation on logistics, critical minerals, or deep tech without India at the absolute forefront. Finally, Part 5. What comes next? Okay, let's zoom out a bit to the global stage and see what the future actually holds after this critical reset button was pushed in France. The ice has been broken, the 50 minutes of private talks have wrapped up. But, as we all know, any relationship is ultimately evaluated on its concrete outcomes. Think about that staggering number, $500 billion. That's a billion with a B. It represents a highly ambitious trade target the two nations have set for themselves over the next 4 years. It is a monumental financial goal that proves both sides still see incredible, untapped potential in their economic partnership, despite all the recent tariffs and turbulence. But to actually hit that $500 billion mark, both sides are going to have to navigate a really massive agenda. They've got to balance their domestic political compulsions with this desperate global need for stability. They must work together to truly realize the strategic potential of the Indo-Pacific theater. They have to reform global economic institutions so they actually reflect current realities. And critically, they have to navigate the complex new frontiers of deep tech, artificial intelligence, and global supply chains. It is a tall order, and it requires genuine, roll-up-your-sleeves cooperation, not just friendly photo ops. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely fascinating question about the sheer power and, the limits of international body language and personal alliances. Can personal chemistry overcome structural geopolitical headwinds? We've seen the bear hugs, we've seen the massive stadium rallies, and now we've seen the restrained taps and the vital closed-door icebreakers. But as the US and India navigate tariffs, visa restrictions, and rapidly shifting global alliances, we have to ask ourselves whether a friendship between two leaders is really enough to steer two massive, complex democracies toward that $500 billion future. It's a question that's going to define the next era of global diplomacy. Thanks so much for joining me in this explainer, and keep your eyes on the data.